I still remember the exact second I realized some people are not judged for who they are, but for how they sound before they even get a chance to speak, and that truth hit harder than anything I had ever seen at a wedding like this. Inside the crystal ballroom of the St. Marlowe Hotel in Manhattan, where billionaire Alexander Grant's wedding was unfolding under golden chandeliers and soft orchestral music that made everything feel like a dream designed for people who never had to worry about being out of place. But in one quiet corner of that perfection stood Sophie Reynolds, holding her clutch tightly as she tried to breathe normally while feeling every eye in the room somehow missing her and yet still judging her at the same time. Because the moment she entered, she was already different from everyone else in the room, not because of who she was, but because of how simply she looked in a navy dress that cost less than a single bottle of champagne being served nearby, and before she could even find a comfortable place to stand, she heard the first whisper, sharp and casual like it meant nothing, asking who invited her, followed by a soft laugh that spread through a small group near the bar, and Sophie lowered her eyes instinctively. Not out of fear, but out of habit. The habit of someone who had learned early that silence sometimes keeps you safe longer than words do. But that silence did not protect her for long because Vanessa Blake, dressed in a shimmering designer gown and surrounded by people who treated her every word like a rule, slowly turned her attention towards Sophie, as if she had found something amusing to break. And with a smile that never reached her eyes, she spoke loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, questioning whether Sophie was lost, or perhaps part of the hotel staff who had accidentally wandered into the wrong celebration, and laughter followed immediately. Not loud at first, but growing in confidence as people realized it was socially acceptable to join in, and Sophie felt the weight of the room shift onto her shoulders without anyone touching her, because that is what social judgment does. It doesn't need force, it only needs agreement. And as Vanessa stepped closer, her tone sharpened, asking if Sophie even understood proper English or if she had simply walked in here pretending to belong. The words were wrapped in elegance, but delivered like a test she was expected to fail, and Sophie's fingers tightened around her clutch as she felt the heat rise in her face. But she still said nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because she was carefully choosing what kind of moment this would become. And across the room, Alexander Grant, the groom himself, stood near the edge of the crowd holding a glass he never drank from, watching the entire scene unfold with a stillness that made him look almost disconnected from the celebration. But his eyes were focused entirely on Sophie, not on the laughter, not on Vanessa, not on the noise, but on Sophie's silence, because there was something unusual about it, something too controlled, too steady to be simple embarrassment, and that detail alone made him take one step forward into the crowd, unnoticed at first, as the laughter around Sophie grew again and Vanessa leaned in for one final push, suggesting loudly that maybe Sophie should prove she even belonged in a room like this by speaking properly into a microphone placed nearby. And in that moment the atmosphere shifted just slightly, because opportunities in rooms like this are rarely given without expectation of failure. And Sophie looked at the microphone not as a chance, but as a trap designed in plain sight, while Alexander continued to watch, now closer than before, waiting for something no one else in the room expected. And what happened next would change the entire direction of the night in a way nobody there was prepared to understand. I thought the worst part would be the laughter, but I was wrong because what came after silence was far more dangerous. It was expectation, and in that ballroom, every eye slowly shifted between Sophie Reynolds and the microphone placed near the stage, as if the entire room had agreed on an unspoken rule that someone like her should struggle the moment attention was placed on her. And Vanessa Blake made sure that expectation stayed alive by stepping slightly aside with a satisfied expression, arms gently crossed, watching as if she had already predicted the outcome, while Sophie remained still, her gaze fixed on the microphone not as an invitation, but as a pressure point designed to expose her. And behind the growing tension, Alexander Grant moved closer through the crowd without announcing himself, his presence quiet but deliberate, because he was no longer simply observing a guest at his wedding. He was observing a pattern he could not ignore. And when Sophie finally lifted her head slightly, it was not because she had decided to comply, but because she had noticed something else, something in Alexander's expression that did not match the rest of the room. There was no mockery there, no impatience, only curiosity, and that difference created a strange stillness between them even across distance. While Vanessa misinterpreted the silence as hesitation and took another step forward, gently encouraging Sophie to speak, saying that surely someone who walked into a place like this must have something to say, and the laughter did not return fully this time. Instead, it became quieter, sharper, more focused, because people were now waiting for a collapse rather than a joke, and Sophie understood that perfectly. She understood that this moment was not about speaking English correctly or incorrectly. It was about whether she would accept the role that had been assigned to her by strangers. And as she exhaled slowly, something in the room shifted again because Alexander suddenly raised his hand slightly and said in a calm voice that cut through the tension without force, "Let her stay." And those words did not defend Sophie directly, but they disrupted the expectation of humiliation, causing several guests to glance at each other in confusion, while Vanessa frowned slightly, as if her control over the situation had just loosened. But Alexander did not stop there, because after a brief pause he turned his attention fully toward Sophie and spoke again, this time with a tone that carried no judgment at all, only certainty, and he said, "Sing." And that single word changed the energy of the entire ballroom more than any speech could have, because it was not a request shaped by curiosity alone. It was a challenge wrapped in calm authority, and Sophie finally moved her eyes from the microphone to him, studying him for a brief moment as if trying to understand whether this was another trap or something else entirely. And in that short silence something unspoken passed between them, not trust, not comfort, but recognition of tension that neither of them fully explained. And then Sophie stepped forward, each movement measured, controlled, as if she had already made a decision long before this moment arrived. While the crowd reacted instantly with shifting expressions, some leaning forward in anticipation, others exchanging skeptical glances, and Vanessa smiled again, softer this time, convinced that whatever came next would confirm her judgment. But Alexander did not look away from Sophie even once. And as she reached the center of the stage area, standing under the warm light that made everything feel more exposed, the room fell into a deeper silence than before, because now there was no more talking, no more laughter, only waiting. And Sophie placed one hand lightly near the microphone stand, not gripping it, not fearing it, simply acknowledging it. And in that moment the entire ballroom felt like it was holding its breath without knowing why, while Alexander remained still at the edge of the crowd, watching not the performance yet, but the person about to reveal whether she was exactly what everyone assumed or something entirely different. I still remember the exact moment when the entire room stopped waiting for a mistake and started waiting for something they could not yet name. Because as Sophie Reynolds stood under the warm stage lighting of the Crystal Ballroom, the silence around her was no longer filled with laughter or judgment, but with something heavier, expectation mixed with disbelief. And she closed her eyes for a brief second as if collecting a memory rather than preparing a performance, while Vanessa Blake stood near the front with a faint smile that suggested confidence in what she believed was about to happen, and Alexander Grant remained completely still at the edge of the crowd, his attention locked on Sophie with a focus that made everything else in the room feel distant. And when Sophie finally opened her eyes again, she did not look at the audience first. She looked slightly past them as if listening to something only she could hear, and then she began to sing. And the first note did not feel like entertainment. It felt like a shift in atmosphere, subtle but undeniable, because her voice carried a clarity that contradicted everything the room had assumed about her just moments earlier. And within seconds the ballroom that once echoed with quiet judgment turned into a space of complete stillness, where even the sound of glassware seemed to disappear. And Sophie continued without hesitation, her voice steady and controlled, rising and falling with an emotional depth that made several guests instinctively lower their eyes, as if they were witnessing something too personal to observe casually, while others slowly straightened in their seats, their expressions changing from skepticism to confusion, and then to something closer to shock. And Vanessa's smile began to fade as the performance continued, replaced by a stillness that no longer looked confident, because what she expected was not happening at all. There was no failure, no stumble, no embarrassment, only precision and emotion blending into something that filled the entire room without permission. And Alexander's expression shifted subtly as well, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to understand what he was hearing rather than simply enjoying it, because there was a familiarity in the control of her voice that did not match the image the room had built of her. And as Sophie reached the middle of the song, her voice lifted into a stronger passage that seemed to carry the weight of something unspoken, something beyond the moment itself, and the reaction in the room began to change again, not all at once, but in waves, as people slowly realized they were no longer watching a humiliation or a social experiment. They were witnessing a talent that demanded attention, and the energy that once fed on judgment now turned into silence that bordered on disbelief, while Sophie remained focused entirely on the performance, as if nothing else existed beyond the song itself. And when she reached the final notes, she held them with a control that made the entire ballroom feel suspended in time. And then, as the last sound faded, there was a moment of absolute silence, so complete it felt almost unnatural, until Alexander Grant began to clap, slowly at first, standing as he did. And that single action broke the stillness like a signal the entire room had been waiting for. Without realizing it, and soon others followed, applause spreading unevenly at first, and then growing stronger as the reality of what they had just witnessed settled in. While Sophie stood still at the center of it all, not smiling broadly, not reacting dramatically, but simply breathing as if she had just set something down that she had been carrying for a very long time. And in that moment, the entire dynamic of the room had already changed, even though no one yet understood how deeply. Because Vanessa was no longer the center of attention, the guests were no longer in control of the narrative, and Alexander's gaze had not left Sophie since the final note, as if he had just seen something that would not allow him to look away again. I thought the applause would be the end of the tension, but it was not, because the moment Sophie Reynolds finished her final note, and the crystal ballroom of the St. Marlowe Hotel erupted into controlled applause, something deeper shifted beneath the surface of the room, something social rather than emotional, and I could see it in the way people began to look at each other instead of at her, as if everyone was quietly recalculating what they had just witnessed, because moments ago she had been the subject of laughter, and now she was the center of attention, and that kind of reversal always makes people uncomfortable, especially in rooms filled with status and ego. And Sophie remained still under the soft stage lighting, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady, not performing anymore, but simply existing in the space she had just transformed, while Vanessa Blake stood frozen near the front row, her expression no longer confident, but unsettled, as if she had misjudged something fundamental and was now trying to recover her position without knowing how. And Alexander Grant, who had stood to clap first, slowly lowered his hands, but did not sit down, his gaze still fixed on Sophie with a level of focus that made it clear this was no longer about social entertainment, because what he had just witnessed was not random talent, it was controlled, intentional, and emotionally structured in a way that suggested experience beyond what the room expected. And as the applause gradually softened, guests began to whisper again. But this time the tone had changed completely, no longer mocking but uncertain, questioning who she was and where she came from. And Sophie finally stepped back slightly from the microphone stand, not in retreat, but in closure, as if she had completed something internal that no one else in the room could fully understand. And that is when Alexander began to move, slowly at first, then with purpose, walking through the thinning crowd without breaking eye contact for long, until he stopped a few feet from the edge of the stage area, close enough now that Sophie could clearly see him without the distortion of distance, and the room around them seemed to quiet again almost instinctively, because people could sense another shift coming, not a performance this time, but an interaction, and Vanessa noticed it too, her eyes tightening slightly as she realized the attention was no longer drifting back to her as she had expected. And Alexander finally spoke, his voice calm but precise, asking Sophie where she had learned to sing like that. And the question was simple but carried weight because it assumed there was a story behind what they had just witnessed. And Sophie hesitated for a brief moment, not out of confusion but caution, as if deciding how much of herself belonged in a room like this. And then she answered softly that she had not learned it here, and that single sentence did more than the performance itself to deepen the mystery around her, because it suggested history, distance, and something unspoken that did not belong to this world of chandeliers and champagne. And Alexander did not immediately respond. but his expression changed slightly, becoming more thoughtful, more attentive, as if he had just confirmed a suspicion rather than received an answer, and behind them the wedding continued in fragments. Music playing softer now. Conversations resuming but lacking energy, because the center of gravity in the room had already moved, and Vanessa slowly stepped back into the crowd, no longer commanding attention, realizing too late that the narrative she tried to control had completely shifted away from her, while Sophie stood at the edge of the stage area, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, but also not yet understood, and Alexander remained facing her, as if the night had only just begun for the two of them, even though the celebration around them was already fading into background noise. I noticed the room was no longer celebrating the wedding. It was reacting to Sophie Reynolds, and that realization spread slowly across the crystal ballroom like a quiet current no one could stop, because after Alexander Grant asked his question and Sophie gave her brief answer, the atmosphere shifted into something far more complex than admiration. It became curiosity mixed with uncertainty, and people who had been laughing earlier were now carefully observing her, as if trying to rebuild their understanding of what they had just seen, while Sophie stood near the edge of the stage area with a calmness that did not match the intensity of the moment she had just created, her posture steady, her expression controlled, as if she had already stepped out of the performance and back into herself, and Alexander remained close, still facing her, not moving away as most people would after such a moment, because something about her answer had clearly affected him, not in an emotional way that was visible, but in a quiet analytical way that suggested he was connecting pieces of information others could not see. And Vanessa Blake, now slightly behind the main group, tried to reinsert herself into the social flow of the room by speaking softly to nearby guests, but it was obvious her influence had weakened because people were no longer looking to her for interpretation of the moment. They were looking at Sophie instead, and as the music from the wedding band continued at a lower volume in the background, almost forgotten, Alexander finally took another step closer and spoke again, this time more gently, asking Sophie if she was staying in New York long, and the question sounded casual on the surface but carried a deeper implication, as if he was trying to understand whether she belonged to this world temporarily or whether she had been hidden within it all along. And Sophie hesitated again, not because she lacked an answer, but because she was carefully choosing what she allowed others to know, and she finally replied that she was only in the city for a short time, which did not fully explain anything and only added to the mystery surrounding her, and Alexander nodded slowly, as if confirming something internally rather than reacting to what she said, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, and that silence between them felt different from the silence earlier in the night. Because it was no longer social tension or judgment, it was observation, recognition, and a growing awareness that this encounter was not random. While around them guests slowly resumed conversations, but in smaller groups, their energy scattered, still occasionally glancing towards Sophie, as if expecting another revelation, and Vanessa, now fully aware that she had lost control of the narrative, stepped back further into the crowd, her expression composed again but her presence no longer central. And Sophie finally shifted her gaze away from Alexander toward the distant lights of Manhattan visible through the tall ballroom windows, as if grounding herself back into reality after what had just happened. But Alexander did not leave her side, and instead stood at a respectful distance, watching her quietly, not interrupting, not pressing further. And in that moment, the wedding that was meant to celebrate unity and joy had transformed into something entirely different. Because the true focus of the evening was no longer the ceremony, but the unanswered question of who Sophie Reynolds really was, and why her presence had changed everything, without her ever raising her voice. I thought the moment would fade after the conversation stopped, but instead it deepened, because when Sophie Reynolds finally turned slightly away from Alexander Grant and looked toward the Manhattan skyline through the tall glass windows of the Crystal Ballroom, there was a shift in her expression that suggested she was no longer performing any version of herself for the room. And that subtle change made Alexander observe her even more carefully, as if he was trying to separate what he had just witnessed on stage from the person standing quietly in front of him now, while the rest of the ballroom slowly returned to its surface-level celebration, with music playing softer, conversations restarting in uneven clusters, and guests still occasionally glancing back towards Sophie, as if expecting another unexpected moment, and Vanessa Blake, now fully aware that she had lost her earlier dominance over the situation, remained within the crowd but no longer positioned at its center, her earlier confidence replaced with controlled composure that did not fully hide her frustration. While Sophie stood near the edge of the stage area, holding her clutch again with both hands, breathing evenly as if grounding herself after stepping out of a different version of reality, and Alexander finally broke the silence between them again, this time in a lower tone, asking her what brought her to a city like New York. And although the question sounded casual, it carried the weight of curiosity that was no longer social but personal in a restrained way. And Sophie hesitated briefly before answering that she was here for temporary personal matters, a response that revealed nothing specific but also confirmed she was not part of this world in the way others assumed. And Alexander nodded slowly, as if filing that information into a larger picture he was quietly building in his mind. And for a moment neither of them spoke again, but the silence between them felt different now, less like distance and more like observation. While behind them, the wedding continued in fragments, with laughter returning in smaller waves and glass clinking softly, yet the emotional center of the room had clearly shifted and would not return to where it was before, because people were no longer focused on the bride or the ceremony, but on the unexpected presence that had changed the energy of the entire evening. And Sophie finally exhaled slowly as she looked away from the city lights and back into the room, noticing how the crowd now viewed her differently, not with laughter anymore, but with caution and curiosity. And Alexander remained where he was, not closing the distance further, but not leaving either, as if he understood that pushing would break something fragile about the moment. And Vanessa, watching from a distance, realized that the narrative she tried to control had fully escaped her influence, because every conversation in the room now returned to the same subject in quiet tones. The woman who had been mocked only moments earlier but now stood at the center of attention without asking for it. And in that shifting atmosphere, Sophie Reynolds was no longer invisible, but she was also not yet understood, and Alexander Grant seemed to recognize that whatever had just begun between them was not an accident of timing, but the beginning of something neither the wedding nor the crowd could contain. I realized something had fundamentally changed in the room when Vanessa Blake stopped trying to be seen and started trying to disappear into the background, because for someone like her, losing control of attention was not just uncomfortable, it was destabilizing. And yet that was exactly what had happened since Sophie Reynolds finished her performance. And now every conversation seemed to drift back toward the same subject no matter how much people tried to redirect it, while Sophie stood near the edge of the stage area, still under soft ambient lighting that no longer felt like a spotlight, but more like a quiet isolation from the rest of the celebration. And Alexander Grant remained nearby, not invading her space, but not leaving it either, as if he understood that distance itself had become part of their interaction. And after a few seconds of silence, he spoke again in a calm voice, asking her if she often performed in public, and Sophie shook her head slightly before answering that she did not, which only deepened the curiosity in his expression because it made what he had just witnessed even harder to categorize. And Alexander took a slow step back, as if giving her room, while still keeping her within his field of attention. And around them, the wedding continued in fragments, with music now feeling more like background noise than celebration, and guests forming small clusters discussing what had happened earlier, replaying her performance in quieter tones, trying to assign meaning to something they did not expect, while Vanessa stood near a group of guests attempting to rejoin conversations. But her influence had clearly weakened because no one was following her lead anymore, and instead she occasionally found herself glancing back towards Sophie with a look that mixed disbelief and frustration. And Sophie finally adjusted her posture slightly, as if preparing to leave the immediate space. But Alexander's voice stopped her again, not with authority but with curiosity, asking if she had ever been professionally trained. And this time Sophie hesitated longer before answering, choosing her words carefully. And when she said she had some training in the past but not recently, it left more questions than answers. And Alexander nodded slowly, as if that partial explanation confirmed a theory he had not yet fully formed. And the silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable, but charged with unspoken understanding. because neither of them treated the moment as finished, while the rest of the ballroom slowly returned to its wedding rhythm, though noticeably altered, less joyful, more reflective, as if everyone had collectively experienced something they were still processing. And Sophie finally looked away from Alexander again toward the far side of the room, where the wedding continued without its earlier energy. And in that brief pause, she seemed aware that she was no longer just a guest passing through, but a presence that had shifted the entire emotional direction of the evening, while Alexander remained where he was, watching her with a steady focus that suggested this was no longer about a single performance, but about understanding a person who did not fit into any assumption the room had made about her. I noticed the moment the wedding stopped being a celebration entirely and became something closer to an unfolding story that no one inside the crystal ballroom of the St. Marlowe Hotel could fully control. Because even though the music continued softly in the background and waiters moved between tables with trays of champagne, the real focus of the room remained fixed on Sophie Reynolds and Alexander Grant, who were still standing within a few steps of each other near the edge of the stage area. And Sophie now appeared more composed than she had been earlier, her posture steady and her expression calm, as if she had already stepped beyond the emotional peak of what had just happened, while Alexander continued to observe her with quiet focus, no longer asking rapid questions, but instead studying her responses as if each detail mattered in a larger understanding he had not yet completed. And after a brief silence, he finally spoke again, asking her if she was originally from New York, and Sophie shook her head slightly before explaining that she was not from the city, and that she had arrived only recently for personal reasons. And that simple answer once again did not clarify anything, but instead expanded the sense of mystery around her, because it suggested she existed outside of the social circle that defined everyone else in the room. And Alexander nodded slowly, as if mentally organizing this information, while around them the guests continued to adjust to the emotional shift that had taken place earlier, with conversations now focusing less on the wedding itself and more on the unexpected performance that had changed the entire atmosphere. And Vanessa Blake, who had previously commanded attention with ease, now found herself positioned at the edge of multiple conversations where her words no longer carried the same influence. And she occasionally glanced towards Sophie with an expression that suggested she was still trying to understand how the situation had reversed so completely, while Sophie subtly adjusted her grip on her clutch, as if preparing to move away from the center of attention. But Alexander's presence remained steady nearby, not blocking her path, but also not allowing the moment to fully end. And after a pause, he asked one final question in a calm tone, whether she would be staying in the city for long, and Sophie replied that she was uncertain, which again left space rather than closure, and Alexander accepted that answer without pressing further. But his expression suggested he was no longer viewing her as a random guest at a wedding, but as someone whose presence carried significance beyond what had been visible at first. And as the evening continued to drift forward, the wedding itself slowly regained its structure, with speeches resuming and guests returning to their seats. Yet the energy remained permanently altered, because no matter how the event progressed, the memory of what had happened earlier continued to shape every interaction, and Sophie eventually turned slightly toward the side of the room as if preparing to leave the immediate space, while Alexander remained where he was, still watching her, not as a host or participant in a celebration, but as someone who had encountered a moment he could not ignore. And in that quiet distance between them, without any formal conclusion, the night had already begun to shift into something that would extend far beyond the walls of the ballroom. I realized the final moments of that night were not about the wedding anymore, but about the silence that followed Sophie Reynolds wherever she stood, because even as the crystal ballroom slowly returned to its formal rhythm, with speeches resuming and guests attempting to rebuild the celebration, the emotional center of the room never fully moved away from her again. And Sophie now stood slightly apart from the main crowd near the side of the hall, her posture calm and composed as if she had already separated herself from everything that had happened earlier, while Alexander Grant remained within a few steps of her position, no longer asking questions, but still watching her with steady attention that did not fade even as others tried to redirect his focus back to the event. And Sophie finally adjusted her stance as if preparing to leave the immediate area, her movements subtle and controlled, while Alexander spoke one last time in a quiet tone, not pressing, not demanding, simply asking if she needed assistance finding